Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video from Aman Talks NRL SuperCoach. In today's video, we're going to finally get some of your teams up on the channel and we're going to be rating them, just giving you my thoughts and opinions around different squad structures that I've been seeing. And thank you to everyone who has submitted their teams. Obviously, I wasn't able to get to everyone's, but the few that I have picked out had something slightly different about them that I did feel was, worth talking about. So obviously, I'll try to do another series of this in the preseason as well. So if you guys enjoy the video, really appreciate a thumbs up. Do please consider subscribing as well to the channel if you haven't already, and let's get straight into it. So before I actually take a look at people's teams, I wanted to kind of draft up a bit of a template team that you basically, I've just gotten from the NRL SuperCoach website, just looking at the highest owned players. And I thought it'd be useful to have this in mind when I'm looking at every person's team. And I've given every team a template rating, just kind of matching the number of players they've got to this template. And the reason is you're probably going to see a few teams that look very straightforward, don't differ too much from this template. But I just want to highlight that, it's not a bad thing necessarily. Obviously, having some pods here and there is always going to be a good thing, but you're going to see very often some of these cheap centres like, Suwali, Coates, Penasini, Targo, and you're going to see Pappenhausen, Tedesco combination. You're going to see some big gun players like Payne Haas and Dave Fafita. Now, they're not necessarily bad picks, so I don't think having these guys in your team is really an issue. So having this in mind when looking at other people's teams will give you that idea of like, look, these are the common players, but they're not necessarily a bad thing. So without fail, we will start getting onto other people's teams now. So firstly, this is from Simon Gillard. So he's got a 13 out of 25 template rating. One reason I liked to talk about his team was that he's gone with the cheap hookers up front. So obviously your main gun like Harry Grant is not going to be available for round one. And we've kind of got a pretty decent cheapie that we think in Chris Randall. Now, he's actually paired him up with Corey Pate from the Broncos. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he has started a few of the trials. I think his position and, in our Supercoach teams really does depend on the impact of Jake Turpin. If he's obviously on the bench, that might eat into his minutes, but 205k could be an option. He has also got dual flexibility, hooker and halfback. So he's gone with the cheap hooker route, and I have started to see a few teams like that. And I think that's very interesting to discuss from a structural standpoint because you can see that does allow quite a good rest of the squad in my opinion. So I overall liked the look of this team. So in the front row forward, he's got Payne Haas and Fanul Blake. I think two really good front row forward selections that you don't really need to change around much for the rest of the season. And Bullimore and Max King. Bullimore we think could be a decent cheapie to start off with, given some forward issues in terms of injuries at the Manly Sea Eagles, and Max King could be an option as a bench prop for the Bulldogs. Now, the starting second row I really do like as well. He's got Crichton in there, who I think is one of the best second row forwards to go for. Ewan Aitken, been really high on him in the preseason. Good early draw for the Warriors. He's got Beau Fermor, so I haven't actually spoken about Fermor that much on the channel recently, but he has started the Titans' recent trial match, and if he gets another starting gig, maybe what I'll do a little bit later in future videos is kind of do a bit more stats analysis on him. But he's got some pretty good stats when he's actually played some decent minutes, and he's got second row forward, center wing, dual flexibility. So 380k could be a decent kind of cash generator / points provider as well in the early parts of the season. On the bench, it's lacking some forward depth. So he's obviously got some players like Tapai Moroa. Moroa was actually named in the reserve grade squad for the Storm, so I don't actually feel like he's going to be included in their 17. So that might potentially nullify him as a cheapie option. Momo Isia from the Knights did actually start in their last trial match. He might be an option, and similar to Tuolagi from the Tigers. So one of the interesting things I also wanted to talk about Simon's team was in the halves and the 5'8 position. So he's actually got Cleary and Munster on his bench. Now Cleary, I'm obviously guessing is a placeholder. If he's fit for round one, he's obviously good to go. And Cam Munster is not going to be available for round one. So I think there is potential where, Simon can obviously, get into the comments and let me know. But if Cleary wasn't out for round one, is his plan to actually bench Cleary and keep him there until he's returned? Or is he going to sell him? I'd probably think that he's going to sell him. But maybe there's a bit of a risk carrying Cam Munster. Instead of having, say, Munster on the bench there, you could maybe use that money to address, say, for example, some of that forward depth in the second row forward. So, maybe, for example, you could swap Munster to, say, like a Toby Sexton. That might save you like 200k. And that 200k can really be bumped up into your second row forwards. Maybe upgrading a Moroa up to like a 350k second row forward. Maybe one of the Cowboys players like Lukey, Cotter, for example. So that's one way that might bolster your overall squad so that you're not having to carry a gun in the first rounds of the season. But I did like his center wing as well. Kurt Mann, I think, is a very interesting pod selection. If he plays at lock, he should hopefully be in for some decent minutes and is pretty good when he plays in the forwards for the Knights. So should be in line for some good points and a nice dual flexible player as well, center wing and 5'8. Not really much else, I think, in the center wings is controversial. You've got Cobbo and Targo, Amon, Suwali, very common players, all from the template. Coates, I'm a bit iffy on myself personally, just because Yes, he's got a nice fixture in round 1 against the Tigers, but the Storm are missing quite a few of their gun players, so how good is he going to go? And it's a couple of rough matchups. I'm just not super confident, I think, in his base. I think he'll be maybe similar output to, say, like a Josh Adokar. So personally for me, I'm not a big fan of Coates, but I do understand why he's such a highly owned player. And then the fullbacks, I don't think there's much of an issue there. I do like the look of Tedesco and Pappenhausen. So overall, Simon's team, I didn't mind. I think maybe personally, I probably wouldn't have Munster on my bench in the 5'8". I'd probably use that to say I'd maybe swap via Ilias, maybe go for like a 400, 500k halfback, maybe a Kiri or a Sam Walker. And that little money saving can be used to kind of bump up one of your second row forwards. And then I think the overall team looks a little bit stronger. Or maybe you could consider using that money, say, on upgrading Corey Pay. Although I do understand the hooker position doesn't have great depth in there. And so you might be able to get away with going with the cheap hooker route. So I think there are some interesting pods there in terms of Fermor and Kurt Mann. I think can be good selections at the beginning of the season. But overall, I think it's a decent squad. Cleary obviously is taking up a lot of that cap as well. But Simon, I think, is a pretty good draft that you've got there. And I think a couple of tweaks, in my own opinion, might make it a really good overall squad. So next up, we're looking at Andy. He's also got a 13 out of 25 template rating. The reason I wanted to speak about Andy's team is the hookers as well. He's got Reid Marnie. I think Reid Marnie is not really someone I seriously considered myself, but watching the Eels trial matches, he's looked pretty sharp. Eels obviously had a great result in the trials over the Panthers, 36-0. I thought Marnie looked good. He scored a try, so I'm actually also thinking about maybe veering away from actually owning Harry Grant in round 1 and instead going to Reid Marnie, saving a little bit of money and capitalizing on Eels actually have a decent draw. It's something I've overlooked actually myself, but they tend to also start pretty good out of the blocks at the beginning of the season. So starting with Marnie, he had a really good start to last season. I don't mind that as a lower owned kind of option as well at the hooker spot. The front row forward is not really that controversial either. Payne Haas and Oitikamanu. I mean, Oitikamanu didn't look the best in the first trial, but for 450k, he probably will deliver on his price tag. And obviously Bullimore we've just spoken about as well. I do really like this starting second row forward as well that you've got there, Andy. So you've got Fafita, you've got Curran, and you've got Pangai. I think they're all fantastic second row forward selections. Curran might be slightly a question mark because it looks like he's going to be actually named in the lock position, but I have a feeling he might have a similar role to what Tohu did, where he would start in the middle, but he would actually kind of drift between that and a back row spot. And I think the fact that they've got a nice early draw makes me think that Curran's still not going to be a bad selection. And I think it's kind of similar to the last team that we just saw as well. Instead, what Andy has done is actually just taken that Cleary money and downgraded to, say, like a Jerome Hughes, and he's actually allowed that kind of bump up in the second row forward. Obviously, the bench is not the best either in terms of having Tuolagi, Momosia, and Gaia, but, if they're all options, potentially they could be good cheapies, but Gaia, I have a feeling, probably won't get a run in the 17. He's actually got a dislocated elbow in the last trial match as well, so he might not be available for a selection in round 1. Obviously, he's going a little bit cheaper in the 5'8 with Hastings and Amon. Now, Hastings, it's an interesting one, whether he actually gets the goal kicking. He wasn't goal kicking when Brooks was on the field in their trial match. If he's not goal kicking, then it's not ideal, but he actually still looked quite good in general play. So Hastings, I don't mind if you are looking to go cheap in the 5'8 position. A point of difference in Jerome Hughes, I don't think that's a bad one. And I do really like the centers that you've got there as well. You've got Aiken, Fermor, Cobbo, Penasini, Targo, Taylor May if he gets a run out, and then a cheapy 175k option. And then obviously the Pappenhausen and Tedesco combination. Now that 175k cheapie could be anyone based on Teamless Tuesday, but I do really like that kind of starting 17. I think it's just the halves that might be a little bit weaker because there's no Cleary, but I think you've used that money elsewhere in a strong way, and I do like that Marnie selection. So yeah, overall, Andy, I thought you had a pretty decent team as well. Just one of the cons that I've listed there is because the money's kind of spread, the risk is if we ever want to go back to, say, like a Nathan Cleary or a Tom Trbojevic, just trying to figure out the obvious ways to get there can be a little bit difficult when we've got that money so spread out. So maybe that's something just to take in mind, just have a plan. So say for the early parts of the season, if you did actually run out with this squad, if, say, Cleary from round 1 was fit, where are you going to kind of, fix your team to try to get to Cleary? And maybe similar with Turbo, but I think that's a conversation that a lot of us are going to be having. So I don't think you're on the only boat there. But yeah, overall, I thought it was a pretty nicely balanced squad. So next up, we've got Owen Eltringham. So the reason I wanted to talk about Owen's team was that it's very, very pod heavy. You can see 8 out of 25 template rating. So there's not too many kind of template picks. So the hookers, similar to the first team that we saw, they've gone with the cheap hooker route and really cheap in the front row forward as well. No Payne Haas, which, to be honest, I think the only player we wanted to spend big in the front row forward is Payne Haas, and he looked really good in the trial. So that's my early kind of maybe criticism, is that maybe I tried to stretch up to Payne Haas, but I don't think the drop off to, say, Fanul Blake is that massive. Fanul Blake I still think is a good selection. Bullimore as your second starting front row forward I think is a risk, because we have a feeling that Bullimore is only going to really get a run in the first few weeks while Schuster is out. It looks like Ola Kawatu could be out for a little bit as well. But for example, if it's only a 2-3 week window, automatically then you're going to be running pretty lean in your front row forward. And in your second row forward as well, there was a bit of a lack of kind of those guns there. We've got Jai Arrow, Fermor, Nane, and then on the bench, Piakua, Momosia, and Tapai Maroa. So I think automatically when I saw this team, it screamed out to me, there's a bit of a lack in the second row forwards, and I think I'd really try to get at least maybe 1 or 2 more guns there. But when I looked at the second screenshot, I realized why that is the case. He's gone big at the back. So from a structural standpoint, this is definitely one of those teams that's gone big at the back as opposed to stacking the pack. So he's got Cleary in there, he's got Munster still riding the bench for round 1, he's got Brian To'o, he's got Trbojevic, so really gone hard on the back. So I think my first instinct is maybe this isn't the right way to go about it for the beginning of the season, just because I have a feeling the points might kind of die down just a little bit. The Turbo, Tedesco and Pappenhausen debate, I've obviously had quite a bit of discussion already on that on the channel. Now, if guys like Pappenhausen are out for round 1, then I think we all need to really consider if we should start with Trbojevic and, run a combo with Tedesco, because I do think having 2 gun fullbacks is the way to go. To'o, I mean, he probably is the gun center wing that I would go for. Just at 730k. Now, this is a point I really wanted to highlight. I heard this on the Searching for Corey Parker podcast, so shout out to those guys. Great podcast. The kind of stocks of To'o also depends on the other winger for the Panthers. So say, for example, if Staines is the other winger, we could expect To'o to maintain his base output, because Staines, we know, doesn't really have that much of a work rate. And To'o has by far the best base power of any centre wing. But if, for example, we had a winger like Taylor May actually line up for the Panthers, maybe he takes away some of the base points that To'o would get, because Taylor May has got a slightly better work rate than Staines. So I think that kind of looking at the other winger and the other backline players in the Panthers might really help, in your selection of To'o. I personally don't think I would go for To'o. I think he probably will be someone we definitely want at some point later in the season. But to start off with, I think it really does hurt the rest of your side. I think there's a lot of good options in the centre wing that are a bit cheaper. You can go with the likes of a Ewan Aitken, a Katoni Staggs, even some of the Dragons players. I think the Dragons have looked really good recently in their trial match against the Rabbitohs. So, guys like Lomax, Terrell Sloan, they're all around that 400, 500k mark. If you kind of took a step down to them, that's automatically 200k that you're saving, and then you can bump that straight into one of your second row forwards. Like, for example, that can be a Jai Arrow to an Angus Crichton upgrade, and automatically I have a better feeling about that second row forward. And maybe similar with Munster, drop down to say like an SJ, that might free you like 200k, not have to carry Munster in round 1, and then you could upgrade one of your front row forwards like Penne to maybe a middling kind of front row forward, maybe like an Oitukamanu. So therefore, you're kind of, again, I'm kind of leaning more towards getting a balanced squad then. But in that sense, you're actually still being able to keep the likes of Nathan Cleary and Trbojevic. The places where I'm taking money out are only To'o and Munster. So I don't think you're really sacrificing on those big guns of Trbojevic and Cleary. That'd be my kind of initial feedback. But there are some interesting pods there. Rocco Berry in the centre wing could be an option given the nice early draw for the Warriors. Then the likes of Nane could be feasible. So that's kind of my general thoughts about this team. There's some things that I like. Definitely having Cleary and Turbo is something that we haven't seen in a lot of teams. But I do think it's sacrificing quite a bit in other areas. And I think I would probably lean towards dropping down To'o and Munster and using that money to kind of boost up your forwards. So Barnsley's team that I've got here, a 13 out of 25 template rating. It's the first team that we've seen that's got Damien Cook in the hooker spot. Now, I'm not a big fan of Cook actually this season, or what I've seen at least in the trial match. I know we shouldn't read too much into trials, but what I highlighted in my hooker video was that Cook's average seems to be in the decline over the past few years. He just doesn't seem to be running the ball as much. It just seems to be a case of, just pass the ball to Cody, and then, let them do the work. And then when Latrell comes back into the frame, I think that's going to be even more of a factor. I do prefer going with, say, like a Reid Marnie or a Harry Grant if you can, kind of stretch up to that, or maybe just take the money out of that position in general. But Cook, I'm not a massive fan of Cook. I don't really see too much value there. And I do think that the likes of Marnie and Grant can outscore him in the early parts of the season. The front row forward is very similar to what I had in my initial draft as well, of Payne Haas and Jai Arrow. I've cooled off a little bit on Jai Arrow after watching that trials. I don't think he was super involved. And so I think at 450k, I'm not sure how much value we're going to get out of him. Paul Vaughan as well, bit of an interesting selection there. I haven't really considered Paul Vaughan that much myself, mainly because I'm just a bit unsure about the minute situation. So 480k seems a little bit pricey in my eyes, especially front row forward. I don't think it's a position where you want to be burning too many trades. I feel like if you wanted to spend the money there at the beginning, Fanua Blake, Payne Haas, and just let them sit there for the rest of the season and use your trades in a more impactful way, say in your centre wings, your halves, and your fullbacks. Now, the second row forwards, a lot of pods here. And again, similar criticism I've had with some of the other teams is that there's a lack of a big gun player like a Angus Crichton or a Dave Fafita. I think one of those two, I really do think should be in most people's teams. So Tino, Victor Radley, and Liam Martin, all three of them around that 400k mark. I just don't see where the absolute value out of them is. I mean, Radley might be a shout, but I've just got a bit of a concern about his kind of suspension and judiciary history. Liam Martin could be okay, but I don't see as much value as well out of him. And Tino, we saw, I mean, he has been named captain of the Titans. Maybe that might have a bit of an impact on him. But personally, I'm not sure if I see, that much kind of growth in, say, price with Tino. I think I would probably look to, say, like one of your front row forwards, maybe drop one of them down to a cheaper option like a Penne or an Ethan Bullimore, and that should hopefully give you around 200k. And then automatically you're talking, instead of a Tino, you're going Angus Crichton, and then I kind of like the look of that a little bit better. Now, I did want to talk about Barnsley's team as well because of the halfback. He's got Mitchell Moses there. So halfback is one of those positions where, if Cleary's not fit for round one, we're going to all be scratching our heads around what do we do with that spot. Now, Moses, the Eels, they've got a pretty nice early draw. He looked pretty good in their trials match as well. He's got the goal kicking. He's normally quite involved as well. So Moses could be a shout. I mean, I've been a little bit burnt by Moses in the past couple of seasons, so I'm not so keen myself, but he could be one of those kind of smoky pods to consider. I do like some other pods that you've actually got in your team. So Lomax, I thought the Dragons looked really impressive. His goal kicking, even though they have a tough draw for the first few rounds of the season, I saw pretty good signs, I think, in that match against the Rabbitohs. I mean, again, should I read so much into a trials match? I'm not sure, but it was a pretty good outing from the Dragons. I think they've got some nice young attacking talent there. So Lomax, I don't mind at that price to kind of just sit there for the rest of the season. I highlighted in my centre wing video that last year, even though he had injuries affecting him, in games he played over about 70 minutes, he was averaging around 60 plus. So he still could be a good option, I think, even at that price tag. Pretty decent other centre wings as well in Aitken, Targo, Penasini and Amon, pretty standard there. Coates, I've kind of given a little bit iffy on him, but I don't think he would be horrible for you. Then the standard Tedesco and Pappenhausen combination, and he's actually got Hastings as well. So there is some money taken out of the halfback spot. So that was my overall concern about the team, was in the second row forwards mainly. Maybe a few too many mid-ranges there around that 400k mark. I think you want to maybe consider, in the kind of downside situation, if Dave Fafita and Angus Crichton start killing it, just trying to think how are you going to get to those players. You're going to have to start using trades to get there, and there might be other things that come up in your team. So I do like the thought of just starting with one of them. I think that was my main thing with the team. Most of it, I think, otherwise looked okay. Adam Clune, actually, in the backup halfback, I should probably discuss him. I mean, I haven't seen Clune in many teams at all. I think the main reason is that even though he's cheap at 293k, the Knights have some uncertainties around them. They've got a pretty tough opening draw as well. So potentially, if he doesn't score that well, you're just going to be sitting there with him. And I do think that maybe there are other better halfback options, and so I'm just not sure entirely about his prospects. And then Hastings, again, some question marks, but I think he looked okay in that trials match as well. So that was my overall concerns around the team. Some things I really do like about it, mainly the pods. I like some of the pods that you've chosen there. Katoa from the Warriors, I like the look of Lomax. Moses, I don't think, even though he's burnt me, I don't think it's an awful punt to go for. So there's a few nice punts there. But I think there are some kind of structural issues I had around the team. So I think really trying to bump up that second row forward would probably be my main feedback with the team. And so the final team that I'm going to touch on is King Diamond Dan. So he's got 11 out of 25 template rating. Now, what I liked most about Dan's team was I think he's got the best crop of guns that you could probably ask for in most of the positions. So for example, he's got Payne Haas in the front row forward. He's got Dave Fafita in second row forward. He's got Cleary at the moment in the halfback position. In the centre wing, there's no obvious gun, but he's got some, the template picks that we'd all kind of expect. And he has got Tom Trbojevic. So he's got a few of those, options, amongst Fafita, Cleary and Trbojevic. Obviously, they're taking up a lot of his salary cap, but he's basically got himself covered for captaincy and vice captaincy probably for the rest of the season, assuming all three of these guys played the rest of the year, without injury. So I definitely do like that part of his team. Having a team that's got Turbo, Cleary and Fafita is a really powerful, way to begin your season. You could have a lot of points on offer there. And I don't mind some of the ways that you've gotten there as well. So say, for example, second row forward, maybe it's a case of mid-ranger danger, but Lukey, Nane, Fermor and Katoa, some risk there in that they're all sub 400k. And so maybe, I don't know, hypothetically, if there's like a 500k, 600k second row forward that starts smashing it, how are you going to get there? But I don't mind the look of any of those picks necessarily, so I think they're all okay, but maybe there's some danger about that. I like the Payne Haas for Neil Blake combination. Obviously, you've managed to make some money as well by saving it in the hookers position. So you got Chris Randall and Kobe Hetherington. So Hetherington, I haven't actually seen in too many teams. Got some handy dual flexibility as well of hooker and second row forward. Started at lock for the Broncos in their trials match. So if he continues to start there, maybe could offer some value at that position. And then obviously you've had to go cheap in the 5'8 spot as well with Amon and Ilias. So there's obviously some places where you've cut corners to save the money, but I do think you've used that money wisely in going for Fafita, Cleary and Turbo. And then you have got Pappenhausen as well, who I do think is probably the second best gun fullback to go for behind Turbo. So overall, yeah, I mean, the team, some people might look at that and fear the fact that you've got a lot of those cheap options in, say, the hooker and the second row forward, but I think that the way that you've used that spare money to go for those 3 and 4 big gun players, I think that could be a nice proposition to begin the season. And you have got, obviously some still hopeful money makers in the center wing, like, your Suwali, Penasini, Targo, Pereira is one that could be a shout as well from the Broncos. And then you've got Cobbo. I think Cobbo is a good shout as well to begin the season if he continues to or be named at fullback spot. So overall, Dan, I thought the team was actually pretty good for a Turbo, Cleary and Fafita team. Now, others who probably want to go for, say, a more balanced squad would just say, well, take out Turbo for Tedesco, and that frees up 500k, and then you can automatically bump up one of your second row forwards to an Angus Crichton, and maybe bump up your backup halfback to, say, like a Toby Sexton, or maybe like an SJ. That's kind of maybe the only feedback I might give in terms of if you are looking to balance the squad a little bit more. But I think the way that you've managed to fit in those big gun players, I don't mind the look of. So that's it, guys. That's the kind of 5 teams that I wanted to discuss. Hopefully you found some value out of me talking about each of the different squad structures and some different players that they all considered as well. So I'll try run another series of this in the preseason as well. I'll put an announcement out on my YouTube page, so definitely subscribe to stay tuned for that. And obviously, if you enjoyed the video, really appreciate a thumbs up, and see you all in the next video.